She left me for her work husband, with the corner office and corporate jet access. Bragged about his power on Instagram while calling me boring. Then his CEO called. Come immediately. Don't tell them. When that private elevator opened, I understood I'd been holding the detonator all along. My name is Daniel Hartwell. I'm 45 years old, and until 3 months ago, I was the regional director of operations for Grandview luxury hotels across the southeastern United States. 16-hour days, constant travel between Atlanta, Miami, and Charleston, making sure every guest experience was flawless. I was good at it. Built my reputation on being the guy who could turn struggling properties into 5-star destinations. My wife Stephanie seemed proud of that. At least, that's what I thought. We'd been married for 11 years. Met at a hotel industry conference in Nashville. She was working in event coordination back then, sharp and ambitious. We clicked immediately. Built a life in Savannah, bought a historic townhouse near Forsyth Park, talked about kids someday when the timing was right. The timing never came, but we were happy. Or I was happy. Turns out there's a difference. It was a Tuesday morning in early September when she left. I remember because I just gotten back from a property inspection in Jacksonville the night before. The azaleas in our garden were still blooming, unseasonably late. I was in the kitchen making coffee when she came downstairs with 2 suitcases I didn't recognize. Designer luggage. Expensive. Not the kind we owned. I'm leaving, Stephanie said. No, we need to talk. Or I'm unhappy. Just a statement of fact, like she was announcing a dinner reservation. I stood there holding the coffee pot, steam rising between us. What? I've outgrown this. She gestured vaguely at the kitchen, at me, at everything we'd built. I need someone who understands ambition. Real ambition. Her voice was steady, almost rehearsed, like she'd practiced this conversation in front of a mirror. I set the coffee pot down carefully, afraid if I moved too quickly, I'd shatter something more than glass. Is there someone else? I asked, though I already knew. She didn't even have the decency to look uncomfortable. Derek understands what it takes to succeed in the corporate world. He's going places, Dan. Big places. Derek Chambers. I knew the name. Her work husband, as she'd jokingly called him for the past year. They worked together at some consulting firm downtown, Sterling Global Advisors. She'd mentioned him maybe a dozen times, always in the context of brilliant strategy or executive vision. I never thought much about it. Trusted her. What a fool. So, you're leaving me for your coworker, I said flatly. I'm choosing a future that matches my potential, she corrected, as if that made it noble. She walked out 20 minutes later. No tears, no apologies, just the sound of her heels clicking across our hardwood floors one last time. I watched from the window as a black Mercedes pulled up. Derek's car. He didn't even have a spine to get out and face me. Just sat there in his expensive German sedan while my wife loaded her new luggage into his trunk. That night, I sat in our living room, in the house we'd restored together, and realized I didn't know my wife at all. Or maybe I'd known her, and she'd simply become someone else. Someone who measured love in LinkedIn endorsements and corner office square footage. 2 days later, her Instagram went from private to public. The first post was a photo of them at some rooftop bar downtown. Her head on his shoulder, champagne flutes raised, both of them dressed like they were auditioning for a corporate lifestyle magazine. The caption made my stomach turn. Finally found someone who matches my drive. Hashtag power couple, hashtag corporate excellence, hashtag new beginnings. I stared at that post for longer than I care to admit. Not because I missed her, but because I couldn't believe how quickly I'd become irrelevant. 11 years reduced to a hashtag about moving forward. But here's what Stephanie didn't know, what she'd never bothered to learn in all our years together. I wasn't just good at managing hotels. I was exceptional at managing details. Documentation. Paperwork. The boring, unglamorous work that keeps empires running. And in her rush to upgrade her life, she'd left behind a paper trail that would change everything. The week after Stephanie left, I did what any rational person does when their world collapses. I went to work. Checked into the Charleston property, reviewed staffing reports, walked the grounds at midnight, making sure the landscape lighting hit every architectural detail perfectly. Normal. Controlled. Predictable. But at night, alone in hotel rooms that weren't mine, I started digging. Not emotionally. Strategically. I pulled up our joint bank statements first. We'd kept most finances separate, but we had one shared account for household expenses and property taxes. The activity logs told an interesting story. Over the past 8 months, Stephanie had been making regular transfers. $2,000 here, $3,500 there. Small enough not to trigger alerts, large enough to add up. By my calculation, she'd moved nearly $48,000 into an account I didn't recognize. I took screenshots of everything, organized them by date in a folder labeled Property Records on my laptop. If anyone ever looked, they'd assume I was documenting hotel renovations. Then I started looking at Sterling Global Advisors, the consulting firm where both Stephanie and Derek worked. Their website was polished corporate nonsense, strategic excellence, transformative solutions, the kind of language that sounds impressive but means absolutely nothing. Derek's profile photo showed him in a power pose, arms crossed, jaw set like he was starring in his own executive superhero movie. Senior Director of Client Strategy. Whatever that meant. But here's where it got interesting. Sterling Global wasn't just some boutique consulting firm. They were a subsidiary, owned by a much larger parent company called Meridian Holdings Group. And Meridian had contracts with half my hotel properties for compliance auditing and risk assessment services. I'd signed some of those contracts myself 2 years ago. Never thought twice about it. I opened my archive files and found the paperwork. Standard consulting agreements, payment structures, liability clauses. But tucked in the back, in the addendums I'd barely glanced at, was something unusual. A compensation clause that granted partial equity shares to approved consultants who brought in contracts exceeding certain thresholds. I read it 3 times to make sure I understood correctly. Then I pulled up my even older files. The ones from when I'd briefly done freelance hospitality consulting before joining Grandview full-time. I'd set up a limited liability company for tax purposes, Hartwell Advisory Services. It had been dormant for 7 years, but I'd never formally dissolved it. And buried in those dusty digital files was a contract I'd completely forgotten about. 5 years ago, Meridian Holdings had acquired a small consulting firm I'd done work for. As part of the acquisition, they'd honored existing contractor agreements by converting them to equity compensation in a holding subsidiary. At the time, I'd received some paperwork about owning 0.0-something% of shares in Meridian Strategic Ventures. The monetary value was so negligible, maybe $800, that I just filed it away and forgotten about it. Until now. I opened a new browser tab and searched for Meridian Strategic Ventures' current structure. It took some digging through corporate registry databases, but I found it. The subsidiary had been restructured 3 years ago, folded into a larger entity. And that entity owned Sterling Global Advisors, which meant, if I was reading this correctly, I technically own a microscopic fractional interest in the company where my ex-wife and her boyfriend worked. I sat back in the hotel desk chair and stared at the screen. This changed things. Not because I wanted revenge. I'm not that person. But because if Derek had been giving Stephanie access to proprietary client information, to strategic plans, to anything remotely confidential, and she wasn't a cleared employee, that was a compliance violation. A serious one. And as a fractional stakeholder, even a laughably small one, I had legal standing to request disclosure of ethical breaches. I reached for my phone, then stopped. This needed to be done carefully. Professionally. The right way. I had time. Stephanie and Derek were too busy playing corporate royalty to notice the foundation shifting beneath them. Let them enjoy it while it lasted. 3 weeks after Stephanie walked out, my phone rang at 11:30 on a Wednesday night. I was in my home office, cross-referencing property tax records with corporate filing documents, when an unknown number lit up my screen. Normally I'd let go to voicemail, but something made me answer. Mr. Hartwell. A woman's voice, crisp and direct. Not a sales call. Speaking, I said. This is Margaret Sterling. I'm the founding partner of Meridian Holdings Group. She paused, letting that sink in. I need you in my office tomorrow morning. 9 sharp. I sat up straighter. Margaret Sterling. The name on half the corporate documents I'd been reviewing. The woman who'd built a consulting empire from nothing back in the 80s. May I ask what this is about? I kept my voice level. You may not, she said, not unkindly. Just matter of fact. But I will tell you this, Mr. Hartwell. Come immediately. Don't tell your ex-wife or her associate Derek Chambers about this call. Don't mention it to anyone. The deliberate inclusion of their names sent ice down my spine. I'll be there, I said. Good. The address is 1847 Peachtree Street Northeast, Atlanta. Top floor. Use the private entrance on the north side. Security will be expecting you. She hung up before I could respond. I sat there holding my phone, mind racing. Margaret Sterling didn't make personal calls to fractional shareholders who owned essentially nothing. This wasn't about my negligible equity stake. This was about something else. I spent the rest of the night not sleeping, but preparing. I printed every document I compiled. Bank statements, transaction records, corporate structure charts, the old equity agreements. Organized them in a leather portfolio that looked professional but not desperate. If this meeting was what I thought it might be, I needed to appear competent, not vengeful. The next morning, I drove to Atlanta. The building at 1847 Peachtree was understated elegance. No flashy signage, just dark glass and granite. Old money architecture. The kind of place that didn't need to advertise its importance. The north entrance was exactly where she'd said. A security guard in a tailored suit checked my ID against a tablet, nodded once, and gestured toward an elevator bank I hadn't noticed. Not the main elevators. A single door, brushed steel, no buttons visible. "Ms. Sterling is expecting you, Mr. Hartwell," the guard said. He swiped a key card, and the elevator doors whispered open. I stepped inside. The doors closed, and the elevator began to move. Not up exactly, but somehow deeper into the building's core. The walls were seamless steel, no panel indicators, no emergency phone, just a small camera lens in the upper corner and silence. When the doors opened, I wasn't prepared for what I saw. The space beyond was nothing like a typical executive floor. No cubicles, no hustle, just a long hallway lined with dark wood panels and recessed lighting. At the end, double doors stood slightly ajar. Through them, I could see a conference table and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Atlanta skyline. And standing beside those windows, hands clasped behind her back, was a woman in her mid-60s with silver hair pulled into a neat bun. She turned as I approached, and her eyes were the coldest, sharpest things I'd ever seen. "Mr. Hartwell," Margaret Sterling said, "thank you for coming. We have a great deal to discuss about your ex-wife's recent activities." In that moment, standing in that hallway with the private elevator behind me and this woman in front of me, I understood the true scale of the game I'd stumbled into. This wasn't just about a divorce. This was about power, real power. And somehow, I'd just been invited to the table. Margaret Sterling didn't waste time on pleasantries. She gestured to a chair at the conference table, and I sat. She remained standing, a power move so obvious it almost made me smile. "Almost. I assume you're wondering why you're here," she said. The thought crossed my mind. I replied evenly. She tapped a tablet on the table, and one of the wall screens illuminated. My face appeared, pulled from some database. Below it, my employment history, education, the dormant LLC, everything. They'd done their homework. "You own 0.07% equity in Meridian Strategic Ventures," Margaret said. "A laughable amount under normal circumstances. However, these are not normal circumstances." She tapped again. Stephanie's face appeared on the screen. Then Derek's. Below their photos, a cascade of data. Meeting logs, email timestamps, file access records. "Your ex-wife," Margaret continued, "has been attending strategic planning sessions at Sterling Global Advisors for the past 6 months. Sessions she had no clearance to attend. Derek Chambers granted her access using his director-level credentials. I kept my face neutral, but my pulse quickened. She participated in discussions about client acquisitions, merger possibilities, and proprietary market analysis," Margaret said. She asked questions, took notes. On 3 occasions, she emailed herself confidential documents from Derek's computer. The screen showed email headers. Stephanie's personal Gmail address receiving files with names like Q3_expansion_strategy_confidential and client_portfolio_analysis_internal. "That's corporate espionage," I said quietly. "That's precisely what it is," Margaret agreed. "And under the shareholder agreement you signed 5 years ago, you have standing to be notified of any ethical breaches that materially affect company operations. This qualifies." She pulled out a chair and sat across from me, her expression unreadable. "Derek Chambers has been with us for 8 years. Competent, ambitious, arrogant. We've tolerated the arrogance because he produces results. But this. She gestured at the screen. This is unacceptable. What do you want from me? I asked. Your presence, she said simply. We're convening a disciplinary board next Tuesday. Derek and Stephanie will be informed of the violations and terminated. I want you there when it happens. I studied her face, looking for the angle. Why? Because they thought you were irrelevant, Margaret said, and for the first time, something like amusement flickered in her eyes. They mocked you publicly, reduced your marriage to a social media punchline, and in their arrogance, they forgot to check who else might be watching. She leaned forward slightly. In this business, Mr. Hartwell, the most dangerous person in any room is the one everyone underestimated. I want them to see you. I want them to understand that their downfall came not from their enemies, but from the man they thought they'd already defeated. I should have felt triumphant. Instead, I felt something colder, more focused. I'll be there, I said. Margaret nodded. Good. My assistant will send you the details. She stood, indicating the meeting was over. And Mr. Hartwell? What happens in that boardroom stays confidential. But what happens after is entirely up to you. I rose and shook her hand. Her grip was firm, businesslike. As I walked back to the private elevator, I understood what she'd really offered me. Not just revenge, not just vindication. She'd offered me the chance to reclaim my narrative, to stop being the punchline and become the ending they never saw coming. The elevator doors closed, and I descended back into the world. But I was no longer the same man who'd entered that building. The days between Margaret Sterling's call and the Tuesday hearing moved like continental drift. Slow, inevitable, building pressure beneath a calm surface. I went to work, managed properties, responded to emails. On the outside, I was the same Daniel Hartwell who'd always been reliable, steady professional. Inside, I was cataloging every piece of evidence like a prosecutor preparing for trial. Saturday morning, Stephanie's Instagram posted a new photo. Her and Derek at some charity gala in Buckhead, both dressed and formal, where that probably cost more than most people's monthly mortgage. The caption read, "When you're with someone who values excellence, every moment feels like an investment in your future. Hashtag power couple, hashtag success mindset, hashtag living my best life." The comments were predictably fawning. Friends congratulating her on finding real love. Strangers praising Derek's accomplishments. One person wrote, "You deserve someone who matches your ambition." I read every comment twice, not because they hurt, but because I wanted to remember the height from which they were about to fall. Sunday evening, I received an email from Margaret's assistant. Subject line, Tuesday logistics. Inside was a detailed schedule. I was to arrive at 8:45 a.m., enter through the north entrance, proceed directly to conference room 7A. Business attire required. A non-disclosure agreement was attached, which I printed, signed, and scanned back within 10 minutes. The NDA was thorough. I couldn't discuss anything that happened in the meeting with anyone outside the room. Violation would result in immediate legal action. I signed it without hesitation. This wasn't about public vindication. This was about watching the truth catch up to people who thought they were too clever to face consequences. Monday night, I barely slept. Not from anxiety, but from the same focused energy I felt before major hotel inspections. The mental checklist running through my mind. Professional appearance. Calm demeanor. Let them see nothing but competence. At 6 a.m., I was already awake. I made coffee, scrambled eggs, ate methodically, showered, shaved, dressed in my best charcoal suit with a navy tie. Conservative. Forgettable. The kind of outfit that says, "I belong here," without drawing attention. The drive to Atlanta took 90 minutes. I arrived at 8:40, parked in the underground garage, and took the private elevator Margaret's assistant had specified. The security guard recognized me this time, just nodded and waved me through. The elevator ascended in silence. When the doors opened, Margaret's assistant was waiting. A woman in her 30s, professional, efficient. "Mr. Hartwell, follow me please," she said without introduction. Conference room 7A was larger than I'd expected. An oval table dominated the center, surrounded by 13 leather chairs. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked Atlanta's skyline. The morning sun cast long shadows across the polished wood surface. Margaret was already there, reviewing documents. She glanced up as I entered. "Mr. Hartwell, please sit here." She gestured to the chair on her right, second from the head of the table. I sat. The position felt deliberate, close to power, but not claiming it. A witness, not a participant. They'll arrive at 9:15, Margaret said, checking her watch. Derek doesn't know you'll be here. Neither does Stephanie. I've found that surprise is often the most effective tool in these situations. What should I expect? I asked quietly. Denial. Anger. Attempts to deflect blame. She closed her folder. Derek will try to minimize. Stephanie will likely claim ignorance. Neither strategy will work. The evidence is irrefutable. Other board members began filing in. I recognized, too, from their corporate photos. Stern faces, expensive suits, people who'd built empires and had no patience for incompetence or betrayal. At 9:12, the door opened again. Derek walked in first, confident as ever, then stopped when he saw the full board assembled. His smile faltered just slightly. Stephanie followed, and when her eyes found mine sitting beside Margaret Sterling, her face went white. For the first time since she'd walked out of our home, I saw genuine fear in her expression. Please sit, Margaret said, gesturing to the two chairs at the far end of the table. The chairs where defendants belong. Derek recovered first. He always did. Charm was his default setting, the mask he wore when uncertainty crept in. Margaret, I wasn't aware this was a full board session, Derek said, attempting casualness as he and Stephanie took their seats. If I'd known, I would have prepared a presentation on the Riverside acquisition. This isn't about Riverside, Margaret said flatly. This is about you, Mr. Chambers. And Ms. Greer. Stephanie's hands were folded on the table, knuckles white. She hadn't looked at me again since that first shocked glance. Derek, however, kept glancing my way, confusion mixing with something darker. Margaret tapped her tablet. The wall screen illuminated with a single image, an email header. From Derek's company account to Stephanie's personal Gmail. Subject: Q2 Strategy Overview Confidential. Over the past 6 months, Margaret began, voice crisp and prosecutorial. You, Mr. Chambers, have granted unauthorized access to proprietary company information to Ms. Greer, a non-employee with no security clearance and no legitimate business need. Derek opened his mouth. Margaret raised one finger, and he closed it. Ms. Greer attended 7 restricted strategy sessions, she continued. She reviewed confidential client portfolios. She participated in discussions about merger possibilities, expansion plans, and competitive positioning. All of this was documented, recorded, and logged. The screen changed. Meeting attendance logs. Stephanie's name, time-stamped entries, digital signatures from Derek's credentials granting her building access. Stephanie finally spoke, her voice shaky. I was just observing. Derek said it would help me understand corporate strategy for my own professional development. Professional development, Margaret repeated, the words dripping with contempt. You took notes. You asked specific questions about client vulnerabilities. On 3 occasions, you emailed yourself documents from Mr. Chambers' computer. The screen showed email after email. Stephanie's personal address receiving files marked internal only, board confidential, restricted distribution. Derek leaned forward, trying to regain control. With respect, Margaret, this seems like an overreaction. Stephanie's background is in event coordination and marketing. She was exploring potential career transitions into consulting. I was mentoring her. You were sleeping with her, said Thomas Drayton, one of the senior board members, his voice like gravel, and using company resources to impress your mistress. The word hung in the air. Mistress. Stephanie flinched as if she'd been slapped. This isn't personal, Derek insisted, but his voice had lost its smooth edge. This is a witch hunt. Margaret slid a document across the table. This is your employment contract, Mr. Chambers. Section 14C specifically prohibits sharing proprietary information with unauthorized individuals. Section 17B prohibits using company credentials to grant access to non-employees. You violated both. Repeatedly. Deliberately. She slid another document to Stephanie. And this, Ms. Greer, is your consulting contract with our subsidiary, Brighton Advisory Services. You signed a non-disclosure agreement. You violated it 6 times that we can prove. Possibly more. Stephanie picked up the document with trembling hands. I didn't know I was violating anything. Derek told me it was fine. Ignorance is not a defense, Margaret said coldly. Derek's mask finally shattered. This is because of him, isn't it? He pointed at me, anger flooding his face. Dan can't handle being left. So he went crying to corporate? This is pathetic. I said nothing. Didn't move. Just held his gaze with the same calm I'd maintained since walking into the room. Margaret's voice cut through like a blade. Mr. Hartwell didn't initiate this investigation, Mr. Chambers. Our internal compliance team flagged the violations during a routine security audit. Mr. Hartwell is here because as a fractional equity holder in Meridian Strategic Ventures, he has legal standing to be notified of ethical breaches. This is policy, not personal vendetta. Derek's face went from red to pale. He owns equity. 0.07%. Margaret confirmed. Acquired 5 years ago through a consulting contract, long before either of you became relevant to this company's operations. Small, forgettable, but legally significant. Stephanie was staring at me now, truly seeing me for perhaps the first time since she'd left. Not as the boring husband she'd outgrown, but as the man who'd quietly held a card she never knew existed. Margaret stood. Derek Chambers, you were terminated effective immediately. Surrender your credentials and company property to security before you leave this building. Stephanie Greer, your consulting contract is revoked. You have 72 hours to return all company materials or face legal action. You can't do this, Derek said, but his voice was hollow. It's already done, Margaret replied. Security appeared at the door, as if they'd been waiting for a cue. Derek and Stephanie were escorted out without ceremony, without dignity, without the power they'd worn like armor just minutes before. As the door closed behind them, Margaret turned to me. Mr. Hartwell, thank you for your presence. This matter is concluded. I stood, shook her hand, and walked out of that boardroom, knowing I'd never see either of them the same way again. And more importantly, they'd never see themselves the same way either. The call came 3 days after the hearing. Stephanie's number flashed on my screen at 11:40 at night. I almost didn't answer, then decided I wanted to hear what desperation sounded like. Daniel, she said, and her voice was raw, scraped clean of the polish she'd worn for months. We need to talk. No, we don't, I said calmly. Please, just 5 minutes. I deserve that much. I almost laughed. You deserve exactly what you got, Stephanie. Nothing more, nothing less. You destroyed my career. Her voice spiked, anger breaking through. Derek lost everything. His job, his reputation. Do you understand what you've done? I didn't do anything, I said, keeping my tone level. You and Derek did this to yourselves. I just happened to own equity in the company where you committed corporate espionage. That's not revenge. That's consequence. It wasn't espionage, she hissed. I was learning. Derek was helping me transition careers. By giving you access to confidential client data, by letting you sit in on restricted strategy sessions. I shook my head, even though she couldn't see it. You broke the law, Stephanie. Multiple laws. The only reason you're not facing criminal charges is because Margaret Sterling decided termination was sufficient. There was silence on the other end. Then, quieter. I didn't know you owned part of the company. You never bothered to learn what I did or how I did it, I said. You were too busy comparing me to Derek's LinkedIn profile. That's not fair. Fair. The word tasted bitter. You left me for your coworker, posted it all over social media, and turned our marriage into a punchline. You call me boring, unambitious, small-minded, and now you want to lecture me about fair. She was crying now. I could hear it. I made a mistake. You made a choice, I corrected. And choices have consequences. You chose Derek. You chose to access information you had no right to see. You chose to mock me publicly. Now you get to live with those choices. Derek's blaming me, she said through tears. He says I push him to let me into those meetings. Says I manipulated him. His lawyer is claiming I seduced him into violating company policy. I felt nothing hearing that. No satisfaction, no pity. Just empty acknowledgement of predictable behavior. Sounds like Derek's showing you exactly who he is when things go wrong, I said. Pay attention this time. I don't have anywhere to go, Stephanie said, her voice breaking completely. I can't afford rent without the consulting income. My sister won't let me stay with her. She said I made my bed. Then lie in it. I said quietly, you wanted a different life. You got one. This is what it looks like. Daniel, please. I hung up, set the phone on my kitchen counter, and stared at it for a long moment. Part of me, a very small part, felt something like regret. Not for her, but for the version of us that might have existed if she'd been honest. If she'd said she was unhappy instead of finding someone else first. But that version didn't exist. Never had. The woman I'd married was either gone or had never been real to begin with. My phone buzzed. A text from Stephanie. I'm sorry. For everything. I deleted it without responding. Apologies don't rebuild trust. They're just words people say when consequences arrive. 2 weeks after the hearing, I started hearing things through the professional grapevine. Margaret Sterling's network was vast, and when someone fell from grace in her orbit, the news traveled fast. Derek had been trying to find work. He'd applied to 3 major consulting firms in Atlanta. All 3 rejected him within days. Word was out. When Meridian Holdings blacklisted someone, other companies paid attention. Nobody wanted to hire a senior director who'd been terminated for ethics violations. He'd posted on LinkedIn about exciting new opportunities and exploring innovative ventures. Corporate speak for unemployed and desperate. The comment section was notably quiet. People who'd praised his every move before were suddenly silent. Stephanie had it worse. Her sister, Jennifer, worked in pharmaceutical sales with some of the same people Stephanie had networked with for years. Jennifer had apparently told everyone exactly why Stephanie was asking to move in. The story spread fast. Within a week, Stephanie's professional reputation was radioactive. She tried to restart her consulting practice independently, created a new website, sent cold emails to potential clients. But when companies Googled her name, they found connections to Sterling Global Advisors and questions about why her contract had been terminated. She landed exactly 0 clients. I learned all this not because I was asking around, but because people in my industry were talking. The hotel business is surprisingly small at the executive level. Everyone knows everyone. And when someone in a related field implodes spectacularly, the story makes rounds. One of my colleagues mentioned seeing Stephanie working in an event planning company in Marietta, not as a consultant, as a coordinator. Entry-level work. The kind of job she'd left behind 10 years ago. Heard she really stepped in it with some corporate scandal, he said over drinks after a property manager's conference. Shame. She had a decent reputation before. People make choices, I said neutrally, sipping my bourbon. He nodded sagely. They do indeed. I didn't correct his assumptions. Didn't defend her or condemn her. Just let the story exist in whatever form it had taken in other people's minds. Meanwhile, my own life was improving in quiet ways. Margaret Sterling had personally recommended me to a luxury resort group looking for operational consultants. The contract was 6 months, excellent pay, and would look impressive on any future resume. I accepted. My townhouse, the one Stephanie and I had restored together, sold for $40,000 over asking price. The market was strong, and historic properties in Savannah were in demand. I used the profit to buy a smaller condo near the waterfront. Less space, better view, no memories. I deleted all my social media accounts. Not dramatically, just quietly. Stopped checking what Stephanie posted. Stopped caring what Derek's professional trajectory looked like. Removed myself from the narrative entirely. One evening, I got a message from Jennifer, Stephanie's sister. We'd always gotten along well, and I'd felt bad about the collateral damage the divorce had caused. Dan, I just wanted to say I'm sorry about everything, she wrote. Stephanie made terrible choices, and you didn't deserve any of it. She's staying with our parents now. Lost her apartment. Couldn't make rent. I read the message twice, then replied simply, "Thank you for reaching out. I hope you're doing well." She responded, "Derek left her, by the way. 2 days after he got fired. Moved back to Tennessee to stay with family. Didn't even tell her he was leaving. Just disappeared." I stared at that message for a long time. Derek had abandoned Stephanie the moment things got difficult. The man she'd called her equal, her match, her future, had vanished the second his corporate facade collapsed. She traded 11 years of marriage for a man who couldn't handle 3 weeks of adversity. I closed the message thread and didn't reply. Some lessons can't be taught. They have to be lived. And Stephanie was learning hers the hard way. 4 months after the hearing, I was sitting in a beachfront restaurant in Charleston when I saw her. Stephanie, working as a server. She wore the standard black uniform, hair pulled back, moving between tables with practiced efficiency. She hadn't seen me yet, and I debated whether to leave before she did. Then she turned, carrying a tray of drinks, and our eyes met. The tray wobbled. She steadied it, set it down at a nearby table, then walked over. Her face was different somehow. Older. The sharp confidence she'd worn like armor had been sanded down to something more human. "Daniel," she said quietly, "I didn't know you were in Charleston." "Property inspection," I said. "I'm consulting for the Harbor Grand now." She nodded, processing that. "That's good. You always did excellent work." An awkward silence stretched between us. Finally, she said, "I'm not going to apologize again. I know it doesn't mean anything to you." "You're right," I said. "It doesn't. But I want you to know I understand now," Stephanie continued, her voice steady despite the tremor underneath. "What I did. What I threw away. I spent 11 years with someone who documented everything, who built systems that lasted, who was reliable even when it wasn't exciting. And I traded that for someone who ran the second things got hard." "Derek showed you who he was," I said. "He did," she agreed. "Turns out ambition without character is just selfishness in a better suit." I studied her face, looking for manipulation, for an angle. Found only exhaustion and something that looked like genuine regret. "I hope you're doing okay," I said, and meant it. Not because I wanted her back, but because holding on to anger was exhausting. "I'm surviving," Stephanie said. "Working here, doing some freelance event planning on weekends. Rebuilt my relationship with my parents. They're helping me get back on my feet." "That's good," I said. "Jennifer told me you're doing well. The consulting work, the new condo. I'm glad." She hesitated, then added, "For what it's worth, I'm not on social media anymore. Deleted everything. Turned out performing my life for strangers was just another way of lying to myself." "That's probably healthy," I said. Her manager called her name. She glanced back, then looked at me one last time. "I won't bother you again," Stephanie said. "But thank you for not destroying me completely when you could have. Margaret Sterling told me you could have pushed for criminal charges. You didn't. That wasn't mercy," I said honestly. "That was just knowing when consequences were sufficient." She nodded, understanding the distinction. "Goodbye, Daniel." "Goodbye, Stephanie." I watched her return to work, moving between tables, rebuilding a life from the ground up. Part of me felt something like pity. The rest of me felt nothing at all. She'd made her choices. Now she was living with them. That was enough. I finished my meal, left a generous tip with a different server, and walked out into the Charleston evening. The air smelled like salt and jasmine, and somewhere in the distance, church bells were ringing. I'd spent months being angry, then strategic, then simply indifferent. Now I was just ready to move forward. Stephanie was her own story now, and I was writing mine. 8 months after the divorce was finalized, Margaret Sterling called me again. "Mr. Hartwell," she said without preamble, "I have a proposition for you." I was in my condo, reviewing contracts for a resort property in Hilton Head. "I'm listening." "Meridian Holdings is expanding our hospitality consulting division," she said. "We need someone with operational expertise and uncompromising ethics. Your name came up repeatedly in our candidate discussions." I set down my pen. "You're offering me a position?" "Senior Director of Hospitality Operations," she confirmed. "Based in Atlanta, but with travel throughout the Southeast. Competitive salary, equity compensation, full benefits." "And Mr. Hartwell?" "This time the equity won't be negligible." I was quiet for a moment, processing. "Why me?" "Because you're competent, discreet, and you understand that reputation is built on reliability, not performance," Margaret said. "And because when your world collapsed, you didn't collapse with it. You documented everything, acted strategically, and let the system handle what the system should handle. That's the kind of judgment I want on my executive team." "When would you need an answer?" "Take a week," she said, "but I don't think you need that long. You're ready for this." She was right. I was. "I accept," I said. "When do I start?" 2 weeks. I'll have my team send the contracts tomorrow." After we hung up, I sat in my condo overlooking the Savannah River and realized something had shifted. For months, I'd been defined by what I'd lost. My marriage, my trust, my old life. But I gained something too. Clarity, strength, the knowledge that I could be dismantled and still rebuild stronger. A week later, I started my new position. The work was challenging, the travel extensive, but I was good at it. Within 3 months, I'd streamlined operations at 4 underperforming properties and brought them back to profitability. Margaret occasionally asked me to attend board meetings, not as the fractional shareholder with negligible equity, but as a senior director whose opinion mattered. I sat in those rooms with confidence, no longer the man who'd been left behind, but someone who'd earned his seat through competence and resilience. One year after Stephanie walked out, I was in Miami for a property opening when my phone buzzed with a message from Jennifer. "Thought you want to know," she wrote. "Stephanie's engaged. Some guy she met at her church. Accountant. Quiet. Nothing like Derek. She seems happy. Or at least, she seems peaceful." I read the message twice, then typed back, "I hope it works out for her." And I meant it. Not because I'd forgiven her completely, but because her happiness or unhappiness no longer affected mine. She was no longer my story. I closed my phone and returned to the resort opening. There were investors to meet, operations to finalize, a future to build that had nothing to do with who I used to be married to. Somewhere behind me, the past was settling into memory. Ahead of me, there was only work, purpose, and a quiet satisfaction of a life rebuilt on my own terms. Stephanie had wanted someone ambitious, someone exciting, someone who matched her drive. She'd left me to find that person, and in the process, I found myself. Turns out, I was more than enough all along.